So I'd like to just now to introduce our speaker today, Matt, who I've known personally for a number of years. Has had very broad experience in insurance, worked in several countries in Europe, also in the USA, Japan and Australia. He's fully qualified in the UK and also in Hungary, I believe, as well as being an associate actuary in the USA. His former role was as Chief Investment Officer at Alico, and he holds a PhD in mathematics and was a former professor in both finance and actuarial science. And some of you who have attended various events will have probably seen him regularly on the speaking circuit, where he does quite a lot of talks. As you all know, because you can see it over there, he's written a book. The wine, incidentally, has the same image as the book. That's why it's that particular variety of Argentinian wine, in case you're wondering. And his book is Solvency: 100 Tips for Managing Insurance Capital in a Shifting Regulatory Landscape. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Matt to introduce the book.
I'm glad to be here, but before I start talking about what I'm going to talk about, I'd like to thank a couple people. I have a couple of sponsors. Fitch Rating has sponsored me, so I expect any insurance company who uses this stuff to get a good rating. And I've been sponsored by Reed Actuarial. I'd also like to thank the City Business Library here in the Guild Hall for allowing me to do the launch here. It was very nice of them. Of course, I thank my publisher for actually publishing the book. That's very helpful. FE Steps. And of course, thanks to Elliot for agreeing to be the moderator tonight. The first question I've gotten from a lot of people is, why exactly 100? It just turned out to be that way, believe it or don't. I had a previous version of the book, which was 96 tips. But I sent it out for review and got talking, and it sort of went up to 100. Actually, now it should be a couple more. As you'll see, now that I was making this presentation, there's a couple things I want to put into the next edition, so we'll see how the number goes. But the biggest critic for this was my oldest daughter, and she said that this symbol that I've chosen, it's like one of those mosquito repellents that you light up at night, and she wondered why I used that, and I tried to explain it to her. She didn't quite get it. Maybe you guys will get it better. And anyways, it's available on amazon.co.uk. The point of the book is this new era that came out of Solvency II. I don't know if Solvency II is going to come in at all. I don't know if it's going to come in anytime soon, but I am of the view that it has changed the world. Even if Solvency II doesn't come in, the ideas are getting into the current ICA and how they do solvency analysis right now, today, even before it comes in. So it is a big idea, and what I would like to talk about is a capital generative insurer. This is what I see from the new regulations. Apart from all the difficulties of actually implementing the regulations and all the calculations and the headache about actually doing it, there is a big promise out there. An insurer who, when selling new business, can generate the capital necessary to support that business. An insurer who's able to actually make projects and generate capital because they're actually managing their risks better or getting better investments. That's the promise. That's the new era. It's not just the regulations that are allowing this. If you look now into the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, thank you for that, yeah. A very friendly crowd, I appreciate that. A lot of these ideas are friendly to the ideas we're going to talk about tonight. So the profits that you generate are not just regulatory profits, but actually go through something that a shareholder might be more interested in. So what's the talk going to talk about? I have four things. This promise of capital generative insurance. It does give a few requirements on the technical side. You need to have faster models. There is a need for speed. To do the faster models, we have to be honest about the uncertainty of models. And if you actually are a little bit honest, you can save yourself lots and lots of time. And then the last thing is actually how we make the quick models. Now, if you read the book, I tried to make it very friendly. It's 10 chapters. It's a very easy read. People can do it on the commute or when you have 5 minutes at home sitting on whatever. It's a very handy place to just read one or two tips and get through it. All the technical and really nitty-gritty type of things I've left for the appendices and in the end notes. This talk is going to be similar to what the book is like. I'm going to give the promise up front, but unlike any previous presentations you've been at from me, I'm going to get a little bit more technical tonight than I might with in other crowds. So this is the idea. What is a capital generative insurer? I have this idea of the spiral of capital generation. If you've seen my previous talks, I promise this is going to be what I did in an hour last time in half a minute, so it's just not a repeat. But the idea is to say what projects might we be able to do that can generate capital, that can reduce our requirements or actually increase our ongoing profitability. If you can start collecting all those, you might get something that looks like this. This is a type of dashboard. Along the top you would say, well, here's a few different projects we could do. I've listed 4 or 5 or 6, and then a combination of them. After getting them down, you try to analyze them and say, this one might generate this much capital, the next one might increase our return on capital by that much. How long would it take us to do it? Does it have any upfront costs? And so forth. A project management type of analysis. I put up 6, but if you're really doing this for a large insurer, you might have 50 or 100. It becomes a real project management just to decide which ones you want to do first. But that's the most important step. Whenever you have a big list of doing things, the most important thing to do is to order the list. So if you're able to figure out of all these projects, let's do this one first and this one second and that one third and that one fourth, that's going to help you organize your life. I guess that's kind of obvious. The whole point is that if you choose a very quick and easy one, use that to generate some capital, and then remember where that capital came from, turn around, reinvest some of that capital in the next project, then the next project will generate more capital, and so forth. That's the spiral of generating capital that I talk about. And that's where this entire symbol comes from. This is this talk. It's on the cover of the book. This is what we're thinking about. You start in the middle. You take your cheapest project, the easiest one that you can do quickly. It also helps you build reputation. You just start one, generate a little bit of capital, reinvest some of that capital into the next project, make a little bit more capital, and you keep on going. You keep on generating more and more capital as you do more and more projects. That's the hope. That's the new era. You can have a world-class insurance company that is completely capital generative, and the whole cost of setting it up, if you're smart and hire good contractors, is going to be whatever the cheapest project was that you started out with. All right. When you're doing this, though, you have to get a lot of good ideas. I like insurance. A lot of people tease actuaries because we're kind of nerdy, but they're smart. There's a lot of good people in insurance. There's a lot of good people on the investment side. There's a lot of people who have ideas. Talk to all of them. Get them on the dashboard. Figure out what they're talking about. But most important, you have to get people speaking the same language. If you're making a team, you want to ask them, are you in a position to affect capital? Am I in a position to affect capital? Does my boss know what I can do for him? Am I getting paid for it? These kinds of things. And if not, why would people do it? Why should we do it? Let's talk about it. Let's make it a goal. And then let's align everybody's interests and being able to make an organization that just sort of starts spitting out extra capital over and above insurance profits. If you're not in such a position, get in such a position. Make one for yourself. That's one of the things that I say in the book. As a matter of fact, teamwork is so important, I dedicated an entire chapter to it. All right. In making a capital model, it's very important to make a slight separation between reporting and capital management. So capital management is a different process. Reporting can sometimes take a whole quarter or a whole year to sometimes get the book out. That's not a way to actually do capital management projects. You need a quick project that you can make decisions from. You need a model that can run quickly and give you quick and good answers. But before you start doing that model, you have to have an idea of how you might be able to generate capital. So going back to the dashboard again, you can make some projects that potentially could lower reserves or increase your run rate or whatever. You need to have an idea that these are projects that we might be doing, and then afterwards you can create the model that actually will capture the right risk profile from that. A lot of people like to say, well, let's just make the model and then see what's going to lower capital or see what's going to make the risk better. But for me, that's the cart before the horse. I think that you have to have a back-of-the-envelope concept of what it is you're going to be doing and then make a model to express that. All right, so what are some ideas? Some are on the dashboard. One of the classic ones is just get better investments. Just go get higher yielding investments. Seems kind of easy, seems kind of obvious. However, in the new regime, high-yielding investments pay you twice. Of course, when you have a high-yielding investment, it's paying you on an ongoing basis. But in the new regime, that higher yield gets into your valuation interest rates for liabilities. Your liabilities get lowered. In both the regulatory sense and in the IFRS sense, those will, well, regulators don't care too much about P&L, but the IFRS will count that lowering of reserves in P&L. So you actually get paid the moment you invest in a high-yielding asset, and then later you also get the return for it. In this sense, if you do this, high-yielding assets are better to have a high duration. So if you're sitting in an annuity company, has a duration of 8, and you can have an option of 2 assets, let's go invest in commodities that give us 12% for 9 months, or let's do something that gives us 10%, a lower yield, but it does it with a duration of 8 or 10. The second one is better because it's going to give you more of a help on the liability side. That high duration is going to lower your liability much better than the short investment will. So in this one, the longer durations are better. This is the basic strategy for generating capital in a life insurance company. The long-dated nature of the liabilities combining with good alternative assets is one way to really make the back book, the stuff that you already have on your balance sheet working for you. Tip number 15. Let's buy out-of-the-money equity options to hedge equity stress. Actually, the last couple times I did a talk, this is one of the ideas that people really liked. It's a very easy idea. I don't really want to go into it because you can go on the web and see my YouTube presentations where I talk about this a little bit. But basically, if the equity stress is 40%, you can buy a 20% out-of-the-money option. You've saved half of your equity requirement. And if the option is well priced, it's a good return on capital. Tip number 18. Reconsider bond spreads relative to the cost of new capital. Now, in other words, whenever you talk to a bond trader, they're going to say, well, how much spread do I make over governments, or how much spread do I make over swap? If instead you can hand them a model that tells what the effect is on capital today, rather than versus the asset, what is the effect on capital, you can retool them to start preferring things that are capital efficient. In point of fact, I do have an opinion that the asset people do a lot of good work relative to the benchmark that we give them, just sometimes it's the wrong benchmark. If we had a quick model that they could understand or at least run, then it'll start generating capital by itself. There's a tip in there that I didn't actually give a number to. I think it was just in one of my paragraphs. Reconsider callable bonds. Actually, about a third to a half of all corporate bonds that you buy are all callable. When you start looking at those in a capital sense, they're very, very, very expensive. The last one, and this is one of the tips I would like to do, I wish I'd sort of put more emphasis on when I was writing it, was that you should reunite the capital and the ALM functions. Nowadays, I don't know what happened. When I was doing things in the beginning of my career, capital was something that you considered as an ALM project. But nowadays, in an insurance company, the capital department and the ALM department sometimes are in different buildings even. To sit down and say, I have an idea if we did these type of swaps and we put this kind of equity option on top of it, the capital effect would be enormous. The pity is that the capital people say, hey, that would be really great, but we don't know how to do it. And the ALM people might understand the derivatives, but not know the goal of the capital. So if somehow you could get the asset managers back to thinking about both investing for the liabilities and the asset and the capital together, then I think a lot of things could happen. All right, more ideas. Tip 12. Do by country diversification of equity investments. Very, very techie idea. I've been doing a lot of validation of Solvency II models over the last 3 years. And it's an easy idea. If you have one equity stress for your entire company, it's usually a larger stress, a larger capital requirement than if you actually ask yourself, why are we investing internationally? A lot of people say, I invest internationally for the diversification. If your model actually goes to the trouble of making a separate equity stress for all the different countries in the world, the overall stress for the entire company actually ends up being lower. It's a little bit more work, but it pays off in the end. Tip number 14, do the same thing except not across countries, diversify into different equity sectors, utilities versus software versus other things. Again, if you can display what the investors are thinking about in their investments, the diversification, if you can really talk to them and understand why they're doing it and create a model that captures all that, usually the amount of risk that's not in the portfolio you can display. If you're really reducing risk through diversification, your model should be able to show that. Same idea, tip 16, except you do it with credit spreads. Nowadays, I don't know how many of you have done any validations in Solvency II, but getting a single A and a triple A spread and just the spreads is enough. The idea of reworking that entire analysis so as we have a utility curve and a pharmaceutical curve and all these different sectors seems like a lot of work, but actually capturing that diversification really pays for it. Along these lines, I have a lot of tips, more than I wanted to put onto one slide, about going into new asset classes. If you get the flavor that different asset classes are important, going into new asset classes is a completely new game in terms of diversification. And this is happening nowadays. If you go to Aviva or a lot of other big names, they're going into solar, they're going into infrastructure bonds, they're diversifying out of credits and taking the capital credit for it. They might have other reasons for doing it like yield, but definitely the diversification has got to be the main driver. Now, if you're on the technical side and you've been doing a little bit of this validation, you might be asking if I've gone nuts. I'm recommending that you shouldn't have one equity stress for your entire company. You should have one for every country of the world. Like, how many is that? I don't even know. 50 or something if you take the major ones. Instead of having 4 credit stresses, triple B, A, double A, and triple A, I'm recommending that you multiply that by 20 because you're going to take a diversification effect. Making a model that's capturing all these different elements seems like madness when you're using these big, big, big models. So one of my tips, tip 17, is at the early part of the book, don't worry about the proliferation of index that I'm recommending. I do know that I'm recommending a lot of new analysis, but it will pay for itself in the end. At the end of the talk, what I'm going to try to chat about is how you can deal with all these new indices without going mad. All right. So we do have a need for speed. I hope I've given you at least a flavor of it. The idea of going into all these different ways of diversifying and capturing all the different dimensions with which we might be able to do diversification, going into new asset classes that have higher yields, going to new asset classes just because they're new and diversifying, will pay off if we can deal with the number of indices. But we need quick models to do it. So we have a need for speed. Complex models fall over. It's like a slow motion death due to the loss of credibility under the accumulation of shortcuts and approximations taken. Nowadays, I know a lot of people who are doing nothing for their lives except calibrations. Some of them love it, but most of them just complain about it because they don't believe it. The calibrations has become a very stylized version of the truth in which you're making very large assumptions, which I'll talk about in a second. And a lot of them wonder if this is the way they want their life to be going. I refer to these large models as Death Stars. They're a big, complicated item that has a life of its own. Death Stars blow up. Okay, this is the thing about Death Stars. As a matter of fact, they always blow up. There's actually a great scene from the first Star Wars, Episode 4, where the TIE fighters are all fighting and all that. But you look at the Death Star command, and the head of the Death Star, who isn't Darth Vader, it's this other guy, one of his lackeys comes up to him and says, "Sir, we've analyzed their attack. There is a danger. Shall we prepare your shuttle?" To which the guy turns and says, "Evacuate! In our moment of victory, you overestimate their chances." And of course, he blows up. But the whole thing about it is this hubris that the big model is the way to run the world is in Star Wars, but it's also in the models that we're doing right now. The sad thing about the Death Star blowing up was that it was preventable. I mean, not that I was rooting for the bad guys or anything, but the technician who had told the head of the Death Star that he should evacuate seemed to know exactly what the problem was. He knew that a bomb could go down that thing, the exhaust shaft, causing a chain reaction and blowing up the entire Death Star. He knew this, but he couldn't do anything about it. I mean, you should have been able to put a lid on the exhaust shaft, or maybe somewhere down the shaft, if not on the top, on the surface. But he couldn't do it. The Death Star was too complicated to make even such a simple change. Death Stars in Star Wars are just like Death Stars that we use in our financial systems. Even the simplest change can't get made. Speeding models allow you to explore. If we had a big one, we could look at all the different dimensions of diversification. We could get a number of new asset classes, I've mentioned this. But we can also do something that's more important. We can play with the model. If it's quick, we can do what ifs, we can do sensitivity analysis, and we can say, how does this change? How sensitive is it to the correlation analysis? How sensitive is it to this, that, or the other thing? When I used to make models, before the regulations tried to tell me how to do it, I would make them and play with them, and I would learn. And by the time I'd run it a few times, I would go, oh, I know what the answer is going to be, because I'd gotten an intuition for it. And I wasn't always perfectly correct, but I was pretty close. The model should build your intuition rather than just give you an answer at the end of the day. So, we need to embrace uncertainty. Let me talk a little bit about uncertainty. This will help us with our speed. It'll allow you to give more analysis. It'll give you greater insight, allow you to do quicker models, and it'll give credit to risky strategies if it's due. All right. I devoted an entire chapter to criticizing economics and modern finance. Very good subjects. The criticism that I lay there are not original for me. It's what they say themselves. So I'm just going with the crowd and exposing Black-Scholes errors and these kinds of things. There is a conflict there. There are assumptions in everything that we use. I explore it in Chapter 5. I'm not going to go into it tonight. I'm giving a presentation next month, but I didn't want to repeat myself too many times. But I do follow on that in Chapter 6 to say uncertainty is rife. Enough so to justify the simpler models. So let's look at that. We spend a lot of time with some aspects of accuracy which are completely overshadowed by others. In particular, we spend a lot of time worrying about sampling error when we're doing scenario testing. We're trying to get all the sampling error out of everything that we're doing. But the parameters that we have chosen are making much more of a difference than anything we've done before. So a typical person when doing a Monte Carlo analysis will say, you know, it's pretty hard to choose a parameter at the beginning, but afterwards it's quite easy. But actually the choosing of the parameter at the beginning is deciding most of the analysis. Let's see how. Just because you fix a parameter doesn't mean it's more certain. It doesn't reduce its uncertainty. So let's do a thought example. Suppose we have a data set with 80 pairs of data, and we're going to try to ask what's the correlation between those data. This is a typical thing. If you're doing an equity analysis, you might take 80 years worth of history and try to say what's the correlation between them. Now, when we calculate, the correlation is, for example, 25. It's very typical to just say, well, that's the correlation, that's it. But it's not the calculation, it's just the point estimate. We forget often, or choose not to remember, that correlation itself has a confidence interval to it. It might be 25 plus or minus something. In this particular case, with 80 data points, 25 is the center of it, but this gives us a range of from 3% to 45%. When you're calculating capital, that's an enormous difference. The amount of change that can make to your capital is actually a lot. That's uncertainty. A correlation from 3 to 45 is a lot of uncertainty. The Extreme Events Working Party did some very good work on equity stresses. They tried to come up with a 1 in 200 stress for equities. If you read their paper, it's very interesting reading. At the end, they said a 1 in 200 stress is somewhere between minus 8% and minus 75%. So what should we use on our balance sheet? Now we choose 40, but actually it's anywhere between all these. They did very, very good work. I have to emphasize this, because they not only said, what is the range if we think it's a t-distribution, or what is the range if we think it's normal? They actually said, well, we don't know which distribution is. I haven't had an apple fall in my head to say that it's going to be the logistic or anything like that. So saying that it could be all these different distributions, what might it be? And this is the range of answers that they came up with. If you look at the correlation, or the 1 in 200 uncertainty that we're talking about, and then compare that to what we do in trying to get the sampling error out of our Monte Carlo analysis, it seems a little bit misguided. It seems like there's too much emphasis on the Monte Carlo sampling error and not enough on actually having a chat about the parameters. Going on about this a little bit more, we might take a history of 50 years and try to ask the question, what's a 1 in 200 event from that? So I said, well, suppose we knew that it was a t distribution with 3 degrees of freedom or 10 degrees of freedom. I'm going to do a simulation and actually try it out. What range of 1 in 200 events do I get? So I'm going to take a sample of 200 and over 50 different simulations and take out the worst. In estimating this, if we ran history a number of times, this is the typical ranges we'd get for a 1 in 200 event. Minus 97 to minus 26 if we have 3 degrees of freedom. Well, we know that the 3 degrees of freedom in T is actually a pretty degenerate kind of distribution. But if you go to something that has even 50 degrees of freedom, that's getting kind of close to the normal. The range of 1 in 200s is still plus or minus 10% around 50 or something like that. Very, very large amounts of uncertainty. So we have huge uncertainty in the stresses that we use. We have it in the correlations we use. But that's only the beginning of uncertainty. When we combine these together, I have a way that I like to look at it. When I say, here's my point estimate for something, I might say a best estimate of capital is going to be 300, 299. But now let's test the parameters. Let's take the 95% confidence interval for each of the risk drivers. If we change that, we get something that's more like 214 to 420. That's already a range more of plus or minus 100. From 300, it's plus or minus 100. That's uncertainty. If you get to the end, well, we actually start saying, well, let's test all of our parameters. Let's test them all in the plus or minus 95% confidence interval, including correlations. So we can get a sample, a capital requirement that might have a median of 300, but the range is anywhere from 100 to 557. Can you imagine going to the regulators and saying, I think it should be 100 today. Oh, well, maybe it should be 557 today. This is a lot of uncertainty when we choose our parameters. Tip 43. When you aggregate, it carries or amplifies the uncertainty. So I show in one of the footnotes, in one of the endnotes, in one of the techie bits that the big managers don't read, that actually all this stuff does not go away in aggregation. It just sort of survives to the end. Tip 44. Know that uncertainty in correlations is enormous. This has a large effect on the final required capital. I think we all know that. As a matter of fact, if you talk to some people who are doing some market valuations and you ask them, hey, can we test the correlation a little bit? Let's just change it by plus or minus 10%. No, don't do that. That's going to have a big effect on the answer. Everybody knows it has a big effect on the answer. So why don't we put that in the shop window? Why don't we say, we don't know? So let's embrace the uncertainty. A lot of people who talk about we need to claim that we don't know. A lot of people in risk stand up and say, we're not certain about that. We really don't know. But it sounds like the philosophers of the actuarial world. They say, we really don't know. We have to professionally be honest about it. I agree with them, but often they don't get heard because in the practical world, who wants to say, yeah, we don't know that much? We need to get these statements out. But I'm not disagreeing with them, but I am saying that we should be uncertain. We should be very honest about our uncertainty for a different reason. If we're honest about how little certainty there is in our capital requirements, it allows us to make a simpler model. So if we say the answer is going to be this range anyways, as long as I can show that I'm not increasing the range with a simpler model, I might as well use it. It's a practical direction in modeling, not just a pedantic one. All right, so here's what I want to talk about. So there's 4 pieces for the remainder of this talk. I want to talk about single distributions a little bit, uncertainty, how you actually deal with it, some shortcuts you can take if you want to think of it that way. I want to talk about this idea that I talk a lot about in my book, the curve of constant loss, and then the goal of what Monte Carlo should be, and then let's get to the real meat of the matter, the techie meat of the matter of the book. How do you actually go about making a quick model? So in the single distribution case, we might get a distribution and we say this is our distribution of loss for one risk driver. You can do Kolmogorov-Smirnov tests or any kind of statistical tests around it. But again, even this distribution is a point estimate of the distribution. The distribution itself comes with some sort of confidence interval, like that. Actually, maybe that doesn't show up, but there's these light lines around the heavy line. The dark one is going to be a t-distribution, and even though it didn't fit to a normal distribution when I tried to do the point estimate, when we take the bounds on the normal, there's a light line above and a light line below. When we consider the bounds, it fits within the confidence interval of the normal distribution. So why do we get all worried that it's not fitting the point distribution correctly? The normal actually, more often than not always, but more often than not, is absolutely good enough to use. So what's this curve of constant loss thing I'd like to talk about? Suppose we had two risk drivers. In this particular example, I'm going to have, you can think of two different sub-portfolios of assets. And we're going to add them all up. This is their quantile, so from the 0% to, and then their 100% goes off the page, but I was only interested in this corner down here. So this is a quantile draft, 0 to 1, 0 to 1. If we had two losses that added up, linear losses, we could ask the question, what's the 1 in 200 event? In this particular case, we could say, well, if we had this loss here, that would be a loss of 3. If we got more and more extreme down to the 0, 0 case, this last loss would look like it was a loss of 9. And the reason I'm going through this example in the linear case is it's easy in this graph, if you think about it, to know which one of these is the 1 in 200 loss. It's this bottom one, because this is 10% and this is 10%. The area of this triangle is 0.5%. So we can change the loss back and forth until we get to that point where the area underneath the curve is 0.5%. Everything along this line, any 2 points we choose along this line will have the same loss. This is the curve, no, line of constant loss. So this one, the loss in this case, the 1 in 200 loss must be 9. Right? That's the linear case. By the way, this is not what they usually mean by linear loss in the sense of normal ones. This is a quantile graph. A very techie comment, but for those of you in the audience doing all that. Not all losses are nice like this. They're not all linear. Some of them might be curvy. All right? These are actually the bad curves. So again, everything along one of these lines has the same loss. This is a 9. This is an 8, and so forth. Now, if we look at this, the area underneath this curve is slightly different. The area under this curve is a little bit more than 1/2, you can see. If it was straight down, that'd be 1/2, but it seems to be picking up a little bit more there. So this one has too much. It's not 0.5%. It's not going to be a 1 in 200 loss. If we wanted to have a 1 in 200 loss, we'd have to move this line down a little bit. We'd have to make it greater than 9. So the fact that this is curving concave towards the base case, 50-50 is going to be the base case. Concave towards the base case means that this is less of it. We have to increase the loss to get the 1 in 200. So if you're concave towards the base case, that means any of the estimates you use, assuming linear, are not going to be conservative. This is actually the case that has run up a lot of times. A lot of companies who do some sort of loss function with a few different drivers, for example, counterparty risk or operational risk, where one of the drivers will be 0 for a large portion of the distribution. It might have a vertical line here, and then a curve, and then a vertical line there. Very, very poorly behaved. The linear assumption does not work well in those situations. On the other side, maybe it curves the other way. This one is an even nicer one. In this case, you can see that because it's curving concave away from the base case, this one has an area that's going to be less than the 1/2. To actually get a 1 in 200 loss, we're going to have to take this 9 and move it away. In this case, the linear assumption would be overly conservative. This kind of analysis works in a quantile land. It actually converts perfectly back to the normal land. So everything that you've heard about linear losses and stuffing, you can still take this away from this meeting and say, if it's concave towards the base case, it's bad. If it's concave away from the base case, it's good. So something like that the conversation goes over. But the whole point that I'm trying to drive here is not just about the concavity. If we can understand these lines, these contour lines, these curves of constant losses, that's actually what's really driving most of our analysis. So I submit that the goal of Monte Carlo should not be to come up with the answer that we put in the balance sheet at the end. The goal of Monte Carlo should be to try to figure out these curves of constant loss. So here's a typical example. We do Monte Carlo, we sample all these different things, And then we might say, 1 in 200 is here. Now, I've drawn the initial curve. We did a few dots. These sort of landed in the 1 in 200 range. This is what we pick off. I drew in the actual black line, which was the actual curve of constant loss, the 1 in 200, sorry, curve of constant loss. It's off a little bit for the first Monte Carlo that you do, but I suggest you do a targeted Monte Carlo. So from one set of Monte Carlos, you can use that to inform where we should look at later. If the curve of constant loss is around here, let's try to do more sampling there and get a better feel for it. So you might sample more points there. Again, you have to work hard. If you're going to change the distribution under which you're going to sample, then you have to work hard to say, what does all that mean? But I work through the mathematics in the book. From doing this, then you can see that now the new points that are lining up with it, those black points, are closer to what the actual 1 in 200 curve of constant loss would be. So the point of Monte Carlo is to sort of feel around to understand these contours, not to just pick out one point in the middle. Okay, the goal of Monte Carlo analysis should be to uncover the shape of the curve of constant loss. And once you have the shape, then actually it's very easy, well, in a geeky kind of way. It's direct, or what's the right word here? It can be done to sort of to analytically figure out what the 1 in 200 must be. Now, the greatest gains can be captured by mixing Monte Carlo and correlation matrix methods. So what are these modular methods? What are these quick ones that I go on about in the book? If we're going to have a capital generative insure, we need to have quick models. Let's talk about it. If you work in the profession, you should probably recognize this. This is the standard formula. Everything's correlation matrix, nothing going on. But this is actually a very nice model because it's already modular. We work with one little box, we get its result, we add it up, we pass it up to the next little box. Has a nice pyramid effect, very well laid out. A lot of people don't like the assumptions that are going there. So instead, they throw out all that structure and they come up with, boom, we're going to throw away all the pyramiding, all the staging that's going on, and we're going to have one big correlation matrix, and we're going to Monte Carlo the whole thing. Except there's a lot of risk drivers associated with that. In doing this, it can be a lot of risk drivers. I've seen some big companies who have 150 risk drivers or something like that that they can't handle, and they try to whack it back down to 50. I'm recommending that you go up to 200, but in a smarter way. What do I recommend? Well, again, using the standard formula as an example, you do some pieces in Monte Carlo and some pieces in correlation matrix. Again, this is not yet original. I haven't said anything particularly new yet. You can take the property piece, for example, and say there's a 1 in 200 effect, there's an overall level effect, and there's a volatility effect, and there's a rental income, and there's a funding price, and you mix them all together, you might have 5 things, and you can come up with one value for the property piece that you pass up. It's very easy to imagine that the lowest level on this analysis could be Monte Carlo, and then you pass it up to a correlation analysis. The thing that is new in my book is that I state that you can actually have not just Monte Carlo underneath the correlation, but you could reverse it. You could have correlation underneath and Monte Carlo above. What's necessary is to actually at each stage not add just the 1 in 200 answer, but to give an entire distribution up. Very, very techy stuff. But then if you actually get the hang of it, you can mix and match. For those bad curves of constant losses, you can put Monte Carlo. For the ones that can survive a linear loss, you lose correlation analysis, and you win quite a few times. If you do this, if you move up the entire distribution, then you can actually use an easy distribution, like I said before. The reason Monte Carlo takes so long is because you try to do all of those different distributions at the same time. You try to do all those things at once, and there's exponential growth in the number of scenarios you need to do. However, if you chop it down so you're only doing 3 or 4 or 5 at a time, those type of analysis can go very quickly. You could have 20 of those and run it on your desktop in a few minutes. The catchphrase for this is that you use the correlation matrix methodology where we can, where this curve of constant loss allows it, but you lose Monte Carlo where you must, only where it's absolutely necessary. So with this quick model, you're able to make a model that runs quickly, you're able to fiddle with it, you're able to learn from it, and you're able to invest in different assets. More to the point, before you started the process, you're able to use all those different dimensions of risk drivers that you wanted to use to get a better equity stress or a better credit stress. Now, these models can be done alongside the current models, like if you're a risk manager and you want to say, there's this huge model that takes 3 months to run. How can I figure out how it's running? Can I get something in parallel? This might be a quick model you do around it. Could be one that replaces it eventually. I'm not pushing for that today. Or it could be something that the capital manager uses to try to figure out which of those projects on the original dashboard is the most interesting. So this is the talk for tonight. As promised, it was one of the techier ones. Monte Carlo and correlation methodologies and distributions and uncertainty. But I think I have, or at least I hope I have, taken you from A to Z. I've shown you the promise of what we're trying to do. I've told you why it needs to be quick. I've told you that it can be profitable to do it quick, so all those capital enhancements and capitals that you want to generate you can do. And then I've given you a flavor of the quick models.